Hey,
Wait.
we're SKIM. I'm
Hello.
Scott,
I'm Kim.
and we're just coming to you today to answer another question that we got, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. Today's question is, are there some conflicts that shouldn't be talked about or should not be talked about? Should you get your spouse involved in all your issues? Okay, so this is kind of a tricky question.
Yeah, it's a
I
good
don't you think
question.
it's a good question, but it's a
questions, yeah.
tricky question because my kind of experience over the last, say, 25 years in ministry and in family, kind of counseling, is that we tend to under communicate. Okay,
Yeah.
on average, the vast majority of couples under communicate. They don't talk enough. So right out of the gate, I would say that there's not going to be a whole lot of issues that you're not going to want to bring to your spouse. I think most of the time, if something's bothering you, if it's something you're processing through, and especially if it affects your attitude, if it affects your outlook on life, if it's something you're struggling with, chances are good you're probably going to want to share that with your spouse, because your spouse is maybe looking on and they don't know what you're going through. They can't read your mind. So they're going, wow, she's off today. I wonder what her deal is. I wonder if I did something wrong. And now you're on eggshells, So I think that the vast majority of the time, you're going to want to share whatever issue it is that you're dealing with. Because even if it's, they say that 70% of communication is nonverbal. So it's facial expressions, it's body position. And if you're struggling with something, even though you're not saying it, chances are very good your spouse is picking up on something and going, something's not right.
Probably like in your attitude.
Yeah, in your attitude. So I would say that the most of the things you will want to share. But with this question, it's a good question because it got us kind of thinking, and Kim and I kind of talked it over. What would be a situation where maybe you're struggling with something, maybe it's just like a personal endeavor, or it's just something that you're self-evaluating on, and you're kind of working on some things, and maybe it's not helpful to share with your spouse. And we just kind of bounced around some ideas, and theoretically, I think there are just a few instances where you might not need to share them with your spouse. So as we talked about that, we'll kick around just some hypotheticals or some things that we talked about that might be a situation. So one of the instances that we came up with is, say for example, as a man, I'm struggling with maybe a wandering eye or something to do with keeping my thoughts captive and my eyes on the straight and narrow. The idea of I'm praying about that, I'm seeking the Lord about that, I'm self-evaluating on that, and I'm trying to make sure, like Job talks about, where he makes a covenant with his eyes and he's not going to look at any impure thing. The thing is if I were working through that and making sure that I was tuning that up in my own spirituality, sharing that with my wife might put a seed of doubt in her head, or it might make her feel insecure, and maybe in that particular situation, might not be a situation where I'd want to share every single thing I was personally working through.
Yeah, I think the initial conversation could be maybe that I, notice something, and so maybe the wife brings it to you, or brings it to the husband, and then you can kind of talk it through. But the fact that you don't have to share every single gory detail, like, oh, I happen to look at this girl, or whatever the
like every single instance of working through that struggle. Like one of the things that, like, it might start with an initial conversation, like, maybe your wife sees you holding a gaze too long and she calls you on it. Okay, now you have an initial conversation, and I think it is appropriate to come back and say, okay, hon, you know what? I want to make sure that I'm approaching that appropriately. I've reached out to some good brothers of mine for accountability. I'm looking
crucial.
into reading this particular book. Maybe it's Every Man's Battle, or one of those classic books for dealing with that subject. You're kind of communicating that you're dealing with the issue, but you're not communicating every time you maybe struggle or stumble or fall or whatever, because that way you're letting them know, hey, I've heard you, I understand you, I recognize it, and I'm working on it. But you're not communicating every little,
like nuance
of it.
Yeah, I think that would be good, because as a wife, I want to know that you are working on it if it is an area that you're struggling in, but I don't necessarily want to know every single thing that's going on in your mind. Just like I'm sure nobody wants to know everything that's going on in my mind. Exactly. So.
Yeah, one of our old pastors, Pastor Dan Flord, he said, what if you had a monitor over your head and people could literally see what you were thinking?
Yikes.
And he used to say, well, you would definitely not want me to be your pastor. And if I could see what you were thinking, I wouldn't want you in my church. Yeah. So it's like, man, there's a lot of stuff ricocheting around in our heads, and God knows. And, it's almost part of the process of sanctification, where you're working through some hard things, but not every single thing you're dealing with needs to come out of your mouth.
Yeah. And the thing is, again, it's like we're not saying that that's okay and just sweep it under the rug. No, you need to deal with it. You need to recognize there's an issue. You need to have accountability, but it's the whole, just, you don't have to be specific about every little thing. Yeah.
So with that, can you think of any other instances where, maybe not telling them every little thing,
Well, it just depends, and every single person's gonna be different, because, like, for instance, if you're having a hard day at work, and do you need to tell me every single thing that happened that day? Probably not, but I need to have an idea, like, you had a hard day, so I can, either think of ways to pray for you, or I can try to show you extra, like love, and extra, like, just, what do you call it? I can't think of the word.
Grace?
Yeah, grace. Like, you know what I mean? So I kind of have a heads up.
Yeah, because if you just come home and kick the dog, it's like, whoa, he just came home and kicked the dog, so to speak. No one's ever going to really hopefully kick the dog. But, the idea of just letting, hey, you know what? I had a really rough day today, man. Just give me some time. And I think that also goes to timing of when you talk. Because I know a lot of times the second the husband comes home, he's had a hard day. He's been getting kicked around all day. He's in a bad mood. The wife's been home with the toddlers and the kids, and she's shot. She is so frustrated. She can't wait to have an adult conversation and get some things off her chest. And the minute he walks through the door, it's like, honey, yeah. And it's like the dad's like, come on, I just got home. So I think there's also some wisdom on when to have these conversations.
Yes.
Give your husband, an hour or so to decompress, and not just hit him with all the day's events, and vice versa. The husband shouldn't just come home and just start blasting his wife like, you wouldn't believe it. Okay,
right.
Let's give ourselves, some transition time here, so that we can acclimate, and then as we do, then we can have some of the conversations we need to have, if we need to have them.
Yeah, and again, it's like Proverbs talks about words fitly spoken or timely spoken are like apples of gold set in silver. So again, it's that whole thing of, yes, you may need to talk about something, but it may not be right the second you get home. So
so it's a matter of just timing at that degree, whether you say it or not. And then some things you might find out you really don't need to say. It's putting undue pressure on your spouse if they don't really need to know about it, and it doesn't affect them directly, and you can handle it without coming to the table with a bad attitude. I would say maybe that's an issue that you can just kind of deal with yourself. But if it's affecting your attitude, if it's affecting your personality, if it's affecting your demeanor, then you need to communicate and let her know what's going on.
Well, I
or
think,
vice versa, she, you.
I think again, it goes back to communication. You know, talk this through. Talk out different scenarios. You know, would it be better for the marriage? Would it not be better for the marriage? I think again, everyone is different and everyone thinks differently. So what might work for one marriage may not work for another marriage. So again, communication, talk to each other. What's helpful, what's not helpful.
And I would definitely say err on the side of over communicating. Err on the side of over communicating, because our experience says is that most people under communicate. So I think that does it for that question. Again, if you have any additional questions, put them down below in the comments, and you know, that could be a future video, or your ideas or thoughts on this subject could be very helpful. So with that, it's Skim signing off.
Bye. Have a good day.